The spreadsheet was still open on her laptop when Ivy heard the front door click. Not the knock she'd been waiting for. Not the apologetic three-rap of someone who knew they were late. Just a click, like someone who still thought they lived there, like someone who'd never once considered that a key was a privilege and not a right. She didn't turn around. The numbers in column D had been wrong all week, and she'd been staring at them for 40 minutes, trying to figure out if the error was hers or if the vendor had miscoded the invoice again. 40 minutes of her life she'd never get back, in a studio apartment where the radiator smelled like burnt dust, and the upstairs neighbor walked like he was trying to collapse the floor. "Hey!" That was Damon's voice. Soft. Careful. The voice he used when he knew. Ivy hit save. "You left your hoodie," she said. She heard him move. The shuffle of his sneakers on the floor she'd mopped the night before, because she couldn't sleep and cleaning was the only thing that felt like control. "Ivy, it's on the chair." She finally turned. "The blue one." By the door, Damon stood in the center of her apartment like he hadn't decided yet whether he was staying or leaving. He looked the same as he always did, good-looking in an easy, effortless way that had once made her feel lucky and now made her feel stupid. He was holding his keys. He still had her key on the ring. She could see the little silver sunflower charm she'd put on it back in February, when things were different, when she was different, when she thought charm and effort and loving someone harder than they loved you back was a strategy instead of a slow bleed. "I need to tell you something," he said. She crossed her arms. "You're marrying Priya." The silence lasted about 3 seconds. "She told you." She texted me a photo of the ring. Ivy kept her voice very even. "From my number." She texted herself from my phone while I was in the shower last week. "I assume she wanted to check whether you'd said anything to me, and then forgot to delete the sent message." She paused. "She's lucky I'm bad at confrontation. She's even luckier I'm bad at revenge." Damon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Priya is your cousin," he finally said, as if this explained something, as if the word cousin was supposed to land like a defense instead of an indictment. "I know who Priya is, Damon. We didn't mean, take the hoodie and your key and go." She uncrossed her arms. "I've got a reconciliation report due at 9 tomorrow morning. I have a $15 error somewhere in these invoices that's making my month-end wrong, and I have not slept more than 4 hours in 4 days because..." She stopped. She wasn't going to say because I knew something was off, and I kept trying to fix myself instead of looking at you. She wasn't going to give him that. Just go. He took the hoodie. He left the key. She wasn't sure whether that was cruelty or cowardice. She'd stopped being able to tell the difference with him 6 months ago. The bar wasn't her usual kind of place. Her usual kind of place was the Thai spot, 2 blocks from her office, where a bowl of noodles cost $11, and the owner's mother always gave her an extra portion of broth because she looked, in the older woman's words, too thin for winter. Her usual kind of place had paper napkins and fluorescent lighting, and she loved it. This place had a marble bar and lighting designed to make everyone look like they had secrets. She'd taken the wrong exit from the parking garage. She'd meant to go home, climb into bed with the reconciliation report, and eat whatever crackers were left in the back of her cabinet. But her feet had walked her 3 blocks east and through a door held open by a man in a black coat who didn't seem to work there but also didn't seem to not work there, and now she was sitting at a bar stool, nursing something the bartender had called a paper plane that tasted like regret but in a good way. The stool beside her was empty. She took out her phone, looked at the spreadsheet again. The error was in cell D47, she was almost certain, some kind of transposition, a 2 and a 7 swapped. It would take her 4 minutes to fix and 20 minutes of sitting here to work up the will. "You're going to wear out the glass, staring at it like that." She looked up. The man had sat down beside her without her noticing, which was strange because he was not the kind of man you didn't notice. He was somewhere in his 40s, dark-haired, wearing a suit that was not new but was excellent. The kind of suit that had been made for a body and then worn until the body and the suit understood each other. He had a scar along his jaw, just below his left ear, the kind that had been stitched in a hurry. His eyes were dark and very still, The way still water is still. Not calm, just depth you couldn't see the bottom of. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the bar in a way that suggested he was somewhere else entirely, and only part of him had bothered to send his body here. It's a spreadsheet, Ivy said. Not the glass. He glanced at her phone, then at her reconciliation report. She blinked. You can read that from there. I can recognize the format. He looked back at the bar. You have a transposition error in D47. The silence stretched out for a full 5 seconds. How? She said. The row total doesn't match the sum of the visible cells by 9. The only way to get a difference of 9 from a 2-digit transposition is to swap a 2 and a 7, or a 7 and a 2. He picked up a glass she hadn't seen arrive, something amber with no ice. Column D is a vendor invoice column. Invoice numbers tend to cluster. You probably have a vendor whose number contains both digits. Ivy stared at him. She said, "Not a question, more like a statement of disbelief." "Vane," he said, just the one word, like it was sufficient, like most people heard it and needed nothing else. She'd find out later why. She fixed the error in her spreadsheet. He watched her do it without comment. The bartender refilled her glass without being asked, which she noticed, and then she noticed that the bartender had not asked the man beside her if he wanted anything either. His glass was simply always full, as if the act of it becoming empty was not permitted in this man's presence. There were other men in the bar. She hadn't clocked them when she came in, but she was clocking them now. 4, positioned at intervals that were too deliberate to be coincidental. Not drinking, watching, not watching her specifically, watching the room, watching the door, watching everything except the man at the bar, which was its own kind of watching. "Are those yours?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Are those what?" "The 4 men at the corners of the room who are very bad at pretending to be regular bar patrons." A pause, the barest shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the concept of one decided against at the last moment. "Yes," he said. "Why does someone need 4 men watching a bar? Because 2 isn't enough and 6 is conspicuous." Ivy considered this. That's actually a reasonable answer. Most of my answers are reasonable. People just don't like what they're reasonable about. She should have left then. She knew she should have left. She had a reconciliation report. She had a $15 error she'd just fixed. She had an ex-boyfriend's key sitting on her kitchen counter, and a cousin. His cousin, her cousin, Priya, with her photo of the ring. And she had 4 hours of sleep banked against a 9 a.m. deadline. And none of this at all, added up to stay and talk to the man with 4 guards and a jaw scar and a voice like low weather. She stayed. She was a bad accountant of her own life, it turned out. She didn't remember, later, how the conversation moved from spreadsheets to everything else. She remembered that he asked questions and actually waited for the answers, which was rarer than it should have been. She remembered that he didn't perform interest. He either was or he wasn't, and that night he was, and she'd felt the difference between that and what she'd been getting for the last 2 years, like the difference between a real window and a painted one. She'd told him about the job. Mid-level accounts payable at a logistics firm. Good at it in a way no one particularly celebrated, the way you could be excellent at something that no one thought of as excellence. She'd told him about the apartment, the $15 error, the radiator, the upstairs neighbor. She had not told him about Damon or Priya. Those were still too raw to touch, the way a new bruise is fine until you brush it. At some point, a man in a grey suit had appeared at Vane's elbow and said something very quietly, and Vane had said, without looking up, "Tell them it waits." The man had left. "Important?" Ivy asked. "Everything is important to someone," he said. "Whether it's important to me is a different question. What makes something important to you?" He looked at her then. Really looked, the kind of looking that felt like being read rather than seen. "Very few things," he said, "which makes it easy to identify them when they show up." She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it under things that sounded like something and might have been nothing and ordered another paper plane. The bar was nearly empty by then. She hadn't noticed the time passing, which was unusual for her. She was constitutionally aware of time, the way people who grew up without enough of it tend to be. Every wasted hour had once meant a bill unpaid or a shift missed or a class she couldn't afford to repeat. Time was money in a way that wasn't a figure of speech for her, it was a ledger. "I should go," she said. "You should," he agreed. Neither of them moved, and then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face. Not much, just a degree of shift. The way a temperature drops before a storm and you feel it before you understand why you feel it. He answered it in a language she didn't recognize. Said 4 words. Ended the call. "I need to leave," he said. "And this is not a good place for you to be alone in approximately 3 minutes. Why 3 minutes? Because that's when the men who've been watching this building since 11 p.m. will decide I'm not coming out the front." Ivy looked at him. "I'm sorry, what?" "Come with me or stay here. If you stay here, go to the back exit through the kitchen, turn left, and walk until you reach the parking structure on Aldrich. Don't take a car from this block tonight." He stood, jacket buttoned one motion. "I'd prefer you came with me." "You'd prefer," she repeated. "Yes. You don't know me. I know your column D error was a transposition in a vendor invoice, coded to a company that supplies 2 separate clients under the same parent account, which means your firm has a classification problem that's going to cause you significant year-end trouble if no one catches it. I know you've been awake for most of 4 days. I know you came into a bar you've never been to before tonight and stayed for 3 hours without once reaching for your phone to call anyone, which means either you have no one to call or you don't want to explain where you are." He paused. "I don't know you, but I know the parts that matter right now." Ivy stood up. She followed him. She would spend a long time afterward thinking about whether that was the smart choice or the only one, and she would eventually conclude that sometimes those are the same thing. The car was black and moved through the city like it owned the streets, which, she would understand later, was roughly accurate. There were 2 men in the front. Neither spoke. The city slid past the windows and she sat with her hands in her lap and her spreadsheet still open on her phone, and she thought, "This is either the worst decision I've ever made or the best one, and I won't know which for a while." "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." "Safe from who?" "From the people who follow me," he said, "and occasionally mistake the people near me for leverage." She absorbed this. "Are you in the Mafia?" she said. The pause was precisely 1 second. "I run a syndicate," he said. "The word Mafia is imprecise. What's the precise word?" "Necessary," he said, and looked out the window, and that was the end of that. The building was not what she'd expected, which said something about what she'd expected. She'd been braced for something theatrical. Something with guards at every door and exposed brick and men cleaning weapons at kitchen tables. What she got was an office. A real one. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. 2 walls of shelving with actual books on them. A desk that was buried under documents the way a working desk should be. A coffee pot on a credenza. A lamp with a bent shade that someone had never gotten around to replacing. A whiteboard with numbers on it. She walked toward the whiteboard before she could stop herself. "This is a cash flow projection," she said. "Yes, it's wrong." Behind her, a silence. She turned. He was watching her from the doorway. "Your operating assumption in column 3 is that the receivables cycle at 30 days. They don't. They cycle at 42 in this kind of structure. You're understating your liquidity gap by about 11%. Very quietly, he said, "How do you know what kind of structure this is? Because I've been doing accounts payable for 8 years for a logistics firm, and your inflow pattern looks like a modified hub and spoke, just with different product." She held his gaze. "I'm not naive. I know what kind of building this is." He walked in, looked at the whiteboard, then at her. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm terrified," she said, "but I'm also right about the receivables cycle, and those are 2 different things." Something moved through his face. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He pulled a chair to the other side of the desk, and they spent the next hour going through the projection line by line, and she found 3 more errors, and he didn't argue with any of them, just marked them and asked questions with the focused attention of someone who understood that being wrong was information, not failure. At one point she said, Why doesn't your regular accountant catch this? My regular accountant catches what I tell him to catch, he said. That's a terrible system, I know. Why do you do it that way? He looked at her for a moment. Because until approximately 2 hours ago, I didn't have a better option. She didn't ask what he meant. The numbers were in front of her, and she understood numbers, and she had learned long ago to be very careful with the things that weren't numbers, the things that could be read multiple ways, the things that looked like one thing in good light and another in bad. She fell asleep in the chair at some point. She woke up with a blanket over her that had not been there before, and pale light coming through the windows, and her phone on the desk beside her showing 6:47 a.m. and 17 unread messages. 3 were from her office, 2 were from a number she didn't recognize, 12 were from Priya. She read the ones from Priya first, in order, the way you probe a wound before you treat it. They started apologetic. They escalated to justifying. By message 9 they had achieved a tone that she could only describe as preemptively aggrieved, as if the act of being caught had transformed somehow into Ivy's fault. She put her phone down. Vane was at his desk. He'd either not slept or had slept somewhere she hadn't seen and come back. He had coffee. He had documents. He was reading something with the same focused stillness he brought to everything, the way some people were permanently in motion, and some people had learned to be very, very still because stillness was a form of power. There's coffee on the credenza, he said, without looking up. She got up, poured a cup, stood at the window. The financial district was waking up below her, the early walkers, the delivery trucks, the first office lights coming on in the buildings across the street. I need to get to work, she said. Someone will drive you. I don't need. Someone will drive you, he said again, mild, final. Not for your protection, for mine. I'd prefer to know you arrived somewhere you intended to be. She turned from the window. He was still reading. Why? She asked. He looked up. Because I decide what's worth keeping track of, he said. And I've decided. She went to work. She submitted the reconciliation report at 8:54 a.m. She fixed the vendor classification issue that was going to cause year-end trouble and sent a memo to her supervisor about it that was probably too long and too detailed and that she'd learned over 8 years of employment. Nobody was actually going to read. Priya called twice. She declined both. At lunch, she sat at her desk and ate the crackers from the back of her cabinet that she'd been planning to eat the night before, and she thought about the whiteboard and the projection and the receivables cycle and the bent lampshade, and she thought about Damon and the key still sitting on her counter, and she thought about Priya with her ring and her 12 messages that wanted Ivy to feel responsible for being the one who'd been betrayed. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. A message, your year-end reclassification will save the firm roughly $40,000 in audit exposure. Your supervisor will not tell you this. I thought you should know. A pause. Then, the coffee was bad. I apologize. She sat very still. Then she typed back, how did you get this number? The reply was immediate, the same way I get most things. She should have been alarmed. She was, technically, alarmed. She catalogued the alarm and set it beside the other things she was feeling, which were numerous and not easily organized, and she typed, that's not an answer. No, he replied. It isn't. She put the phone down, picked up the crackers, looked at her screen, put the crackers down and picked up the phone again. The coffee is always bad when the grind is too coarse, she typed. You need a finer grind for that machine. 3 minutes passed. Come back, he replied, and fix it. She went back. Not that night and not because he'd asked. She went back 4 days later because she'd been thinking about the projection, and there was a depreciation schedule on one of the sub-ledgers that was using a 15-year amortization on an asset class that should have been 7. And it was the kind of thing that would be fine until it was suddenly, catastrophically not fine. And she'd learned in 8 years that those were the errors that ended careers. She told herself this was why. She was a passable liar about most things and a terrible liar about numbers, and her internal accounts had been running a deficit for years. He opened the door himself. No men in the hallway. Just him, in a different suit, with a different expression, less closed. Or maybe she was just getting better at reading the fractions of his face that moved. Depreciation schedule, she said. Hello, Ivy, he said. You have a 7-year asset class amortized at 15. It's in the sub-ledger for the Harwick account. He stepped back, let her in. She walked past him to the desk. Hello? She added. There's coffee, he said. Did you fix the grind? Finer, he said. You can evaluate it yourself. She poured a cup. It was better, materially better. She drank it standing at the credenza. And then she sat down at the desk and pulled the sub-ledger toward her and started working. And he sat across from her and started working. And for a long time, neither of them said anything, because the work didn't require it. This was, she would think later, the thing that was hardest to explain to people who hadn't felt it. What it was like to be in a room with someone who didn't need you to perform, who didn't need you to be easier or smaller or more decorative, who sat across a desk and let you be exactly as precise and exacting and unadorned as you actually were, and treated it not as a personality flaw to be managed, but as a quality to be used. Damon had loved her the way you loved something convenient. She'd been close and available and low maintenance in his estimation, which had been wrong, but he'd never asked hard enough to find out. Vane had met her in a bar on the worst night of her recent life and handed her the error in her spreadsheet before he'd asked her name. She knew which one of those was more honest. Who did the Harwick amortization? She asked, around 9 o'clock without looking up. My previous bookkeeper. Where is he now? A pause. Retired. She looked up. Voluntarily, he added, dry. I wasn't asking what you did with him. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. I was clarifying preemptively. She looked back at the ledger. You need a full audit of the sub-ledgers, all of them. Some of these schedules are going to have the same problem. Whoever set them up didn't know the asset class rules and nobody corrected him because nobody was looking. Nobody was looking, he repeated. You want accurate books or you want comfortable books, she said. You can have one. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how long for all the sub-ledgers? Depends on how many there are. 14, 2 weeks if I work evenings, 3 if something comes up. Another pause. What do you want for the audit? Yes, she looked at him. He was watching her with that still, deep attention, the kind that felt like being taken seriously, which she'd been underpaid for long enough to know had its own value. I want you to fire whoever set up these depreciation schedules and never let someone that unqualified near a ledger again, she said. And I want whatever information you apparently have about my firm's audit exposure to not be used against anyone I work with. That's not payment, he said. That's terms. I know the difference. What do you want? She thought about the rent she was 3 weeks from not being able to cover, the dental appointment she'd been deferring since March, the number in her savings account that had stopped going up the year she'd met Damon, not because of him directly, just because of all the small ways she'd stopped keeping strict track of herself. She named a number. He didn't blink. Per audit or in total, Tobler, per subledger. He nodded once. Done. She went back to the ledger. Outside the window, the city hummed. The coffee pot kept the room from being too quiet. The bent lampshade threw light at a slight angle that she'd started to find familiar, the way you found things familiar that you'd been near long enough. You're not what I expected, he said, near midnight. What did you expect? Someone who'd need more convincing. Someone who'd want more explanation. People who come into this office usually want a context they can make comfortable. I'm an accountant, she said. I work with what's in front of me. The rest is just narrative. And what's in front of you? She closed the subledger, looked at him. 14 subledgers with structural errors, a cash flow projection that understates liquidity risk by 11%, and a man who fixed his coffee grind on a single note from someone he met 3 days ago. She paused. That's what's in front of me. The lamp threw its crooked light between them. Evie, he said. Vane, she said. Stay. She looked at the stack of ledgers, at the whiteboard, at the coffee pot and the bent lampshade and the window full of city lights and the man across the desk who ran things that didn't have comfortable names and kept books that needed her and had heard her say the receivables cycle at 42 and treated it like the most natural thing in the world. She thought about Damon's key on her counter, Priya's 12 messages, the crackers in the back of the cabinet, the raise she'd been waiting for since January that she now understood she was never actually going to get, because her supervisor was never actually going to read the memo, because nobody was looking. "I'll need remote access to the ledger system," she said. "I'll have it set up by morning. And I want it in writing. The per ledger rate. I don't do handshake deals." "Neither do I," he said. "Not with people I intend to keep." She picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. "Vane?" "Yes, the cash flow projection. The receivables issue. How long have you known it was wrong?" He was quiet for exactly one breath. "Since I built it," he said. "I was waiting for someone who'd say it out loud." She left. She came back in the morning, and the morning after that, the ledgers were a disaster, and the work was real, and the coffee was reliably good now, and outside the window the city did what cities do. Hummed and churned and moved its money around in patterns that only looked like chaos until you knew how to read them. She was very good at reading them. She had always been very good at this. She was just, finally, somewhere that knew it.